The planet Krogg Prime was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. Imagine a world perpetually shrouded in a turquoise twilight, where towering coral-like structures scraped the sky, and the air hummed with the constant rhythmic pulse of unseen machinery. Now drain all the charm and spontaneity from that image and replace it with obsessive scheduling and bureaucratic efficiency. That was Krogg Prime. Gary, a tourist from Earth, found himself profoundly, existentially bored. He'd arrived with a suitcase full of misplaced optimism and a phrase book promising thrilling interspecies encounters. Instead, he was stuck on a rigidly scheduled tour, shuffling between pre-approved sightseeing locations with a gaggle of equally unenthusiastic humans. The Krogg, a species resembling bipedal, heavily armored lobsters, took their routines very seriously. Every sunrise, every nutrient-paced ration, every mandatory civic celebration was dictated by a series of complex algorithms. Spontaneity was not just frowned upon, it was a Class 3 offense punishable by mandatory seaweed harvesting. Gary stifled a yawn as their Krogg guide, a particularly dour specimen named Glar, droned on about the historical significance of a meticulously manicured kelp garden. And thus, Glar intoned, his voice a monotone rasp, the great kelp uprising of 347. Gary's mind drifted. He thought of Earth, of greasy burgers and unpredictable weather, and the beautiful chaos of a crowded marketplace. Anything, he thought, would be better than this aquatic purgatory. That's when he saw the poster. It was plastered on a nearby plinth, a splash of vibrant purple against the muted blues and greens of the Krogg cityscape. The arena, it proclaimed, in bold angular Krogg script, followed by a series of symbols Gary couldn't decipher. Beneath the headline, a single word was translated into basic Galactic standard. Trials. Trials, eh? Gary muttered to himself, eyes narrowing. Anything, sounding as ominous as the arena, and trials was infinitely more interesting than kelp. Glar, oblivious to Gary's burgeoning interest, continued his lecture. And the strategic deployment of aquatic snails. Gary tuned him out completely. He sidled away from the tour group, drawn to the poster like a moth to a strangely purple flame. A small Krogg security guard stood beside the plinth, its armored claws clasped behind its back. Gary approached, flashing what he hoped was a disarming smile. "Excuse me," he said, "this arena thing. What's it all about?" The guard swiveled its eye stalks towards him, emitting a series of clicks and whistles that Gary's translator identified as a formal greeting. "The arena is the sacred testing ground for Krogg leadership potential. Only the most intellectually and strategically gifted may compete." "Intellectually, huh?" Gary raised an eyebrow. He wasn't exactly known for his strategic brilliance. His greatest accomplishment to date was probably beating level 7 of Candy Crush. Still, anything was better than seaweed. "So, how does one compete?" Gary asked, feigning a casual interest that would have fooled no one, least of all a Krogg security guard. The guard paused, its eye stalks blinking slowly. "Selection for the trials is a rigorous process. Candidates must demonstrate exceptional aptitude in Krogg history, tactical simulations, and advanced kelp management." Gary suppressed a snort. "Kelp management? Seriously?" Right. Sounds exclusive." He paused for a beat, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Say, just out of curiosity, hypothetically speaking, could anyone volunteer?" The guard tilted its head, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both confusion and suspicion. "Volunteer? The concept is illogical. Why would a non-Krogg wish to subject themselves to the trials?" Gary shrugged, adopting his most nonchalant expression. "Just, broadening my cultural horizons, immersing myself in the local customs. For science." He winked. The guard remained unimpressed. "The trials are not a form of entertainment," the guard stated flatly. "They are a matter of utmost importance to the Krogg High Command. Furthermore, your species is unsuitable." Gary bristled slightly. "Unsuitable? And why is that?" "Your brain structure," the guard said, with a dismissive wave of its claw, "is inefficient. prone to illogical thought processes and humor. Hey, Gary protested. I'll have you know I'm perfectly logical and my humor is, well, it's subjective. An idea sparked in Gary's mind, an audacious, ridiculous idea that was born of pure, unadulterated boredom. He was going to volunteer for the Krogg Arena trials. He didn't know what to expect, but he figured at the very least it would be a good story to tell back on Earth. Look, Gary said, leaning closer to the guard. I understand your concerns, but I'm telling you I'm highly qualified. I've got a very special set of skills. Skills that would make me a valuable asset to your kelp managing endeavors. He tried to sound serious, but a giggle threatened to escape. The guard stared at him for a long moment, its eye stalks narrowing. Gary could practically feel the Krogg logic circuits whirring, struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. Finally, the guard sighed, a sound like escaping steam. Very well, it said, its voice laced with resignation. I will file a request. Do not expect approval. The Krogg High Command does not take kindly to whimsical applications. Gary grinned. That's all I ask. Thanks, buddy. You won't regret this. He strolled back to the tour group, a spring in his step. Glar was still droning on about aquatic snails. Gary barely noticed. He was already mentally preparing for the arena trials, whatever they might be. He had no idea what he was getting into. He thought he was entering an arena. He would soon find out he was walking into history, or perhaps a cosmic joke only he was in on. The next day, Gary found himself standing before the entrance to the arena. It wasn't what he expected. He'd envisioned a gladiatorial combat zone, perhaps, with roaring crowds and deadly obstacles. Instead, he faced a sterile, brightly lit room, more akin to a television studio than a battlefield. A Krogg official, even more dour than Glar, approached him. Human Gary, it announced, its voice amplified by a small speaker attached to its gi carapace. You have been granted provisional access to the trials. Do not expect leniency. Gary swallowed, a flicker of apprehension fluttering in his stomach. He plastered on a confident grin. Leniency? Please. I thrive on adversity. He didn't, but the Krogg didn't need to know that. He was led into the arena and his jaw nearly dropped. There were no weapons, no warriors, no roaring crowds. Instead, a single podium stood center stage, facing a panel of stern-looking Krogg judges. Above the podium, a massive screen flickered with symbols and equations. What in the name of... Gary muttered under his breath. The Krogg official cleared its throat. Welcome, human Gary, to the Krogg Arena trials. You will be tested on your knowledge of Krogg history, strategic thinking, and cultural understanding. Your performance will determine your suitability. Gary stared at the screen, then back at the judges. Wait a minute, he said. This is a quiz show? A collective murmur rippled through the Krogg audience, which Gary now noticed was composed of rows upon rows of identically armored Krogg all staring at him with intense curiosity. A quiz show? The official repeated, its eye stalks narrowing. Explain. You know, Gary said, gesturing vaguely. Like questions and answers. Points. Maybe a grand prize at the end? The official remained impassive. The purpose of the trials is not frivolous entertainment. It is to identify the most capable leaders for the Krogg military. Gary blinked. You select your military leaders based on trivia? The official puffed out its chest. Our methods are based on centuries of rigorous analysis and logical deduction. The trials have proven to be the most effective means of identifying strategic aptitude. Gary couldn't help but laugh. You're kidding, right? You're telling me the fate of your entire civilization rests on Jeopardy? The Krogg audience erupted in a cacophony of clicks and whistles, a sound Gary interpreted as a mixture of confusion and outrage. The official slammed a claw on the podium. Silence, it bellowed. Human Gary, you will refrain from making disrespectful comparisons. The trials will now commence. The screen flickered, displaying the first question. In what year did the Great Kelp Migration reach its optimal westward trajectory? resulting in a 7.3% increase in nutrient yield for the southern colonies. Gary stared blankly at the screen. Kelp migration? Nutrient yield? He hadn't the faintest idea. He stalled for time, scratching his chin and feigning deep thought. The Krogg judges watched him expectantly, their eye stalks unwavering. Then, an image flashed in his mind. A documentary he'd once watched on Earth about the migration patterns of wildebeest. A completely irrelevant piece of information, utterly useless in any practical context. But maybe. Gary took a deep breath. Is it 2347? The Krogg official paused, its eye stalks blinking rapidly. The screen flashed green. Correct. Gary stared in disbelief. He'd guessed. Pure dumb luck. The Krogg audience erupted in another wave of clicks and whistles, this time with a hint of something akin to awe. The next question appeared. What was the primary catalyst for the third snail uprising? And how did it impact the distribution of aquatic resources in Sector Gamma? Gary racked his brain. Snails? Aquatic resources? He was drawing a complete blank. Then another random memory surfaced. A line from a cheesy sci-fi movie he'd seen as a kid. Something about a rebellion and greed? He shrugged. Was it, the snail's insatiable lust for power? The screen flashed green. Again. Correct. Gary's jaw dropped. He was acing this thing. He had no idea what he was talking about, but somehow, his vast but utterly useless knowledge of Earth pop culture was perfectly aligned with the bizarre trivia of Krogg military strategy. The Krogg judges were visibly bewildered. Their meticulously crafted system for identifying leadership potential was being undermined by a human tourist armed with nothing but random facts and a healthy dose of sarcasm. Gary grinned. He was having the time of his life, and he had a feeling things were about to get a whole lot weirder. The Krogg were not merely confused, they were existentially challenged. Gary's answers were anomalies. They defied all known parameters of Krogg logic and strategic analysis. His responses weren't just wrong, they were spectacularly, beautifully irrelevant. It was as if he was speaking a language no Krogg could comprehend, yet somehow it aligned perfectly with the correct answers. The algorithms that governed the arena trials sputtered and whirred, attempting to process the input. Statistical probabilities were recalculated, predictive models were rewritten, but nothing could account for the sheer randomness of Gary's knowledge base. He was a walking, talking chaos variable, a glitch in the matrix of Krogg military planning. High Chancellor Vords, a Krogg of considerable and self-proclaimed intellect, slammed a claw against his control panel. Recalibrate the cognitive filters, he ordered, his voice a guttural rasp. He must be employing some form of advanced code-breaking technique. No being can possess such a disorganized collection of data. But even as Vords barked orders, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his meticulously ordered mind. Was it possible that the human possessed a form of intelligence so alien, so beyond the Krogg understanding that it appeared as mere randomness? The thought was unsettling. Gary, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of his accidental success. He had no idea what the questions truly meant or the implications of his answers. He was simply enjoying the chaos he was creating, the look of utter bewilderment on the faces of the Krogg judges. He leaned into the microphone, a mischievous glint in his eye. So, he drawled, when do I get my prize? A year's supply of kelp? A ride on one of those cool submarines? The Krogg official who had escorted him into the arena twitched. Silence, human Gary, it hissed. You are disrupting the sanctity of the trials. Gary shrugged. Hey, I'm just asking questions. Seems like that's what this whole thing is about, right? He winked, a gesture that was utterly lost on the Krogg, who interpreted it as some sort of bizarre ocular spasm. The next question appeared, on the screen. Detail the socio-economic impact of the great algae bloom of 3212 on the lower caste larval populations, with specific emphasis on its influence on the benthic methane production quotas. Gary stared at the screen, his mind drawing A complete blank. Algae blooms, methane quotas. He might as well be reading ancient Sanskrit. But then, a memory flickered to life. A documentary he'd half-watched about the mating rituals of deep-sea anglerfish. Something about competition, resources, and, well, it was a long shot. He cleared his throat. Isn't that when the little guy started demanding better? Dating apps? The screen flashed green. The Krogg audience erupted. This time the clicks and whistles were louder, more frenzied. Some of the Krogg officials actually recoiled in horror. Vors gripped the arms of his throne, his eye stalks wide with disbelief. Dating apps? He croaked. He is mocking us. Gary, oblivious to the rising tide of Krogg consternation, grinned. Hey, if it works, right? He gave a thumbs up, another gesture that was completely misinterpreted by the Krogg as some sort of aggressive display. The Krogg were no longer simply confused. They were deeply, profoundly disturbed. Gary's nonchalant attitude, his inappropriate jokes, his complete disregard for the gravity of the situation. It was all too much. He was a walking, talking violation of Krogg cultural norms, a rogue element in their perfectly ordered society. The Krogg High Command began to suspect that Gary was not merely a clueless tourist. He was something far more dangerous. Perhaps he was a spy, sent by a rival aquatic civilization to undermine their leadership selection process. Or perhaps he was something even more sinister, a master strategist, subtly manipulating the trials to achieve some unknown, nefarious goal. One thing was certain: Gary's presence in the arena was no longer a joke. It was a threat, and the Krogg were determined to neutralize it one way or another. The atmosphere in the arena shifted. The earlier confusion of the Krogg audience was replaced by a palpable tension. High Chancellor Vors, his eye stalks narrowed, addressed the assembly. Human Gary's responses demonstrate either unparalleled genius or calculated disruption. We must ascertain the truth. He signaled to a tech crew who immediately began recalibrating the question parameters. The next round would not be about obscure historical data or trivial biological facts. It would be about strategy. Pure, unadulterated Krogg military strategy. The questions that flashed onto the screen were dizzyingly complex. They involved hypothetical battle scenarios, intricate supply chain logistics, and multi-layered tactical deployments. These were the kinds of challenges that Krogg commanders spent their entire lives preparing for, the kind that separated the brilliant strategists from the cannon fodder. Gary stared at the screen, a flicker of something akin to recognition in his eyes. These weren't algae blooms or dating apps. This was something he understood. Not in the Krogg way, of course, but in a way that was perhaps even more dangerous. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Now we're talking." The first question involved a hypothetical invasion of a heavily fortified kelp forest. The Krogg expected a detailed breakdown of troop movements, resource allocation, and defensive countermeasures. Gary, however, simply chuckled. "Easy," he said. "You just gotta Zerg rush 'em." A collective gasp echoed through the arena. "Zerg rush?" Vors sputtered. What is this Zerg rush?" Gary explained with a surprising degree of enthusiasm. The basic principles of the Zerg rush, an overwhelming early-game offensive tactic from the popular Earth strategy game, StarCraft. It was a strategy based on speed, aggression, and sheer numbers, sacrificing long-term sustainability for immediate dominance. To the Krogg, it was anathema to everything they believed in. Their military doctrine was based on meticulous planning, calculated risk assessment, and the careful preservation of resources. A Zerg rush was barbaric, reckless, and utterly illogical. And yet, as Gary explained the nuances of the tactic, the Krogg began to see its potential. In the right circumstances, against the right opponent, it could be devastatingly effective. The screen flashed green. The next question involved a complex naval engagement in a treacherous underwater canyon. The Krogg anticipated a lengthy analysis of hydrodynamics, sonar technology, and torpedo trajectory calculations. Gary, however, simply shrugged. "Just gotta build a bunch of battleships and spam the torpedoes," he said. "GG, no re." Vors nearly choked. "Battleships?" he wheezed. "Spam? What is this? Adolescent jargon?" Gary patiently explained the concept of battleship spamming, a strategy from the Earth naval warfare game, Naval Assault 7. It involved mass-producing heavily armed battleships and unleashing a relentless barrage of torpedoes, overwhelming the enemy with sheer firepower. Again, the Krogg were appalled. It was a crude, unsophisticated tactic, devoid of any finesse or strategic depth. But as Gary elaborated on the finer points of battleship design, torpedo guidance systems, and the psychological impact of overwhelming firepower, they began to grudgingly acknowledge its merits. The screen flashed green. The questions continued, each one more complex and challenging than the last. And each time, Gary responded with a seemingly simplistic, yet surprisingly effective strategy gleaned from his vast knowledge of Earth board games and military history. He cited Sun Tzu's Art of War, Clausewitz's On War, and even the surprisingly relevant tactical insights of the board game, Risk. The Krogg High Command watched in stunned silence. They had expected to expose Gary as a fraud, a charlatan, who had somehow stumbled his way through the early rounds. Instead, they had discovered something far more disturbing, a human who possessed a deep, if somewhat unconventional, understanding of strategy and tactics. Was he a spy, a saboteur, or something else entirely? The Krogg had no idea. But one thing was clear. Gary was a wild card, a chaotic element that threatened to disrupt the very foundations of their society, and they had no idea how to stop him. The final question materialized on the screen, pulsing with an ominous crimson glow. High Chancellor Vors announced, his voice echoing with a newfound solemnity. "This is the Carconian Gambit. It is unwinnable. It is designed to test the very limits of strategic thought. No Krogg has ever solved it." The scenario was indeed ludicrously complex. It involved a multi-dimensional war across several star systems, resource constraints that defied logic, and an enemy with seemingly limitless technological capabilities. The Krogg had designed it as a theoretical exercise, a way to push their commanders to think outside the box, even when victory was impossible. Gary stared at the question, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered to himself, "Multi-dimensional warfare, resource scarcity. Sounds kinda like..." His eyes widened. "Wait a minute. I think I remember something about this." He straightened up, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Okay," he announced. "I've got it." The Krogg leaned forward, their eye stalks twitching with anticipation. What brilliant strategy would the human devise to overcome this insurmountable challenge? What profound insight would he reveal about the nature of warfare itself? Gary cleared his throat and began to explain his solution. "Okay, so first, you gotta understand the Grobble paradox." A ripple of confusion went through the Krogg audience. "Grobble paradox?" Vors echoed, his voice laced with skepticism. "What is this Grobble paradox?" "It's from this old Earth strategy game, Cosmic Warlords 7, The Revenge of Grobnar," Gary explained. "Basically, the Grobbles are this super-advanced race that can manipulate the fabric of spacetime, but they're also, like, really, really dumb," he continued. "So the key is to exploit their stupidity. You gotta use a reverse psychology feint to convince them that you're actually trying to lose. Then, while they're busy celebrating their inevitable victory, you hit them with a quantum entanglement surprise attack from behind." The Krogg stared blankly at the screen. None of this made any sense. Reverse psychology, quantum entanglement. These were concepts that were utterly alien to their rigid, logic-based culture. "And then," Gary continued, his voice rising with excitement, "you gotta unleash the dancing Banana Gambit to distract their main fleet while you secretly reroute power to the auxiliary grid and initiate a self-destruct sequence in their primary computing core. Boom! Game over! Silence descended upon the arena. The Krogg High Command exchanged bewildered glances. Had the human finally cracked? Was this some kind of elaborate joke? High Chancellor Vords, his face a mask of confusion, stammered, "Dancing, Banana, Gambit, self-destruct sequence?" Gary nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, it's totally foolproof. Trust me, I've used it like 1,000,000 times." Suddenly, a klaxon blared throughout the arena. Red lights flashed and the ground began to tremble. A synthesized voice announced, "Warning, system override. Dancing Banana Gambit detected. Initiating self-destruct sequence." The Krogg panicked. They scrambled for the exits, their rigid discipline momentarily forgotten. Vors, his eye stalks wide with terror, shrieked, "What have you done, human?" Gary shrugged. "Hey, you asked me to solve the unwinnable scenario. I solved it." The shaking intensified. Cracks appeared in the arena walls. The synthesized voice continued its countdown. 10, 9, 8. Just when it seemed like all was lost, the countdown stopped. The klaxons fell silent and the red lights faded. The arena was still intact. The synthesized voice announced, "System override complete. Dancing Banana Gambit successfully executed. Carconian Gambit solved." A collective gasp filled the arena. The Krogg High Command stared at Gary with a mixture of awe and horror. High Chancellor Vors, recovering from his near-death experience, stammered, "Impossible. The Carconian Gambit. It was designed to be unsolvable." But the system didn't lie. Gary's ridiculous solution, based on a nonsensical Earth strategy game, had somehow triggered a system override, proving that even the most complex problems could be solved with a healthy dose of absurdity. Then, as if on cue, the entire Krogg High Command rose to their feet. They began chanting in unison, their voices echoing through the arena. "All hail the Supreme Commander! All hail the Supreme Commander!" Gary blinked. "Wait, what? Supreme Commander? I don't want to be Supreme Commander, I just wanted to get out of this stupid tour." But his protests were drowned out by the roaring applause of the Krogg populace. They surged forward, hoisting Gary onto their shoulders and carrying him out of the arena. He was swept up in a wave of blue bodies, his protests lost in the din. A lavish parade snaked through the streets of the Krogg capital. Gary, perched atop a float shaped like a giant banana, waved weakly at the cheering crowds. Streamers of blue seaweed rained down upon him, and Krogg musicians played a discordant melody on their kelp horn instruments. He caught sight of High Chancellor Vors, who gave him a stiff nod of respect. Even the sternest Krogg official couldn't deny the system's verdict. Gary was now their supreme commander, the ultimate strategist, a legend in the making. As the parade wound down, Gary finally managed to wriggle free from the crowd. He found a transport ship heading back to Earth and booked the first available passage. "Well," he muttered to himself as the ship blasted off, leaving the planet behind. "That was weird. Guess I learned a valuable lesson about alien cultures. And maybe," he added with a wry grin, "about the power of the dancing Banana Gambit." Years passed on Krogg Prime, and Gary's influence, though unintentional, became deeply ingrained in their culture. Krogg High Command, still reeling from the dancing Banana Gambit, decided to integrate Earth pop culture into their strategic training programs. They believed that by studying the illogical, unpredictable nature of human entertainment, they could unlock new levels of strategic thinking. Simulation chambers were filled with reruns of sitcoms, strategy games, and even Earth reality television. The results were mixed. On one hand, Krogg strategists began developing remarkably innovative battle tactics. They learned to think outside the box, to embrace the unexpected, and to utilize unconventional strategies. On the other hand, their military decisions became increasingly bizarre. One particularly infamous incident involved a fleet of Krogg warships attempting to confuse enemy forces by performing a synchronized swimming routine. Another involved trying to resolve an intergalactic trade dispute through a reality show competition. Gary, meanwhile, watched these developments from the comfort of Earth. He'd check in on the Krogg news feeds every now and then, chuckling to himself as he read about their latest strategic innovations and utterly baffling military blunders. "Guess I really messed with their heads, huh?" he'd say to himself, shaking his head with amusement. He'd idly flick through channels, eventually settling on an old rerun of that very Earth strategy game that he accidentally quoted and helped him take over an alien race in the first place. He knew they would never understand the joke, or even the references. And somewhere deep down that was probably for the best.